The world is at war, but not where you think. You're not in a battlefield. There are no sirens outside your window, no visible threat in front of you. And yet, your heart races. Your body tightens. Your thoughts loop like something is about to go wrong. It feels real. That's because, to your brain, it is real. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish between an actual war zone and the constant stream of information, tension, and emotional signals you expose yourself to every day. It only responds to what you repeatedly feel. And if what you repeatedly feel is urgency, fear, outrage, uncertainty, then your body begins to live in a permanent state of defense. Not occasionally, but constantly. This is where something subtle and dangerous begins to happen. Because the more your body experiences these states, the more familiar they become. And what is familiar starts to feel normal, even if it's slowly draining you. You wake up and check your phone. News, messages, problems, opinions, conflict. Without realizing it, your attention is pulled into a field of tension before your day even begins. And your brain starts firing in patterns that match that tension. Your body follows. Hormones shift. Breathing changes. Muscles prepare. Not because something is happening, but because your system has learned that something is always about to happen. This is how conditioning works. Not through one dramatic event, but through small, repeated emotional exposures that train your system to expect chaos. Over time, your internal state becomes shaped by what you repeatedly pay attention to. And here's the part most people never question. You can become addicted to this state without realizing it. The rush of checking, the anticipation, the subtle anxiety. It keeps your system alert, engaged, reactive, alive, but not at peace, as explored in the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza. The body begins to memorize emotional states faster than the mind can consciously process them, which means your body can be living in yesterday's fear, even when today is safe. So you're no longer responding to reality. You're responding to memory, to patterns, to familiar emotions that have been rehearsed so many times they feel like truth. And once that happens, something even deeper takes place. Your identity begins to organize itself around those feelings. You don't just experience stress. You become someone who is always anticipating the next problem. You don't just feel tension. You become someone who expects life to be tense. And this shift is quiet, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Because now, your thoughts, your decisions, and even your perception of reality start aligning with that internal state. Not because it's accurate, but because it's familiar. And what's familiar feels safe, even when it's not. So the question isn't whether the world is at war. The question is, why is your body acting like it never left the battlefield? And what is it costing you to stay there? What if nothing is actually wrong? But your body refuses to believe it. You sit in a quiet room. No danger, no urgency, no immediate threat. And yet, there's a subtle tension in your chest, a restlessness you can't quite explain, a low-level noise inside your mind that keeps searching for something to fix, solve, or anticipate. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's always there. And because it's always there, you stopped questioning it. This is where the illusion deepens. Because the brain doesn't just react to intense experiences, it adapts to repeated subtle ones. The small emotional patterns you rehearse daily begin to shape how your system defines normal. Not truth, not reality, just normal. So if you've spent enough time feeling slightly on edge, slightly rushed, slightly concerned, your body begins to interpret calm as unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. Have you ever noticed that? Moments where everything is fine, but you still feel like something is missing? Or worse, like something is about to go wrong. That's not intuition. That's conditioning. Your nervous system has been trained to expect stimulation, tension, and emotional activity. And when those signals disappear, it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like something is off. So what does the brain do? It starts searching, scanning, reaching for thoughts that match the internal state it knows best. And eventually, it finds something. A problem, a worry, a memory, a possibility. Anything that restores the familiar chemistry your body has learned to depend on. This is how thought loops are born. Not from logic, but from emotional habit. Your attention follows your internal state, not the other way around. And once your attention locks onto something, it reinforces the very feeling that created it in the first place. A closed circuit, self-sustaining, invisible. You think you're reacting to life, but in reality, you're recreating a state your body has memorized over and over again. This is why breaking free isn't about thinking positive, because your thoughts are not leading the experience. Your body is. And your body only trusts what it has experienced repeatedly. So even if your conscious mind wants calm, wants clarity, wants something different, your system pulls you back into what feels known, predictable, safe, even if that safe state is actually stress. And this is where most people get stuck without realizing it. They try to change their life without realizing their body is resisting the change, not because something is wrong with them, but because their system is doing exactly what it was trained to do: maintain familiarity, maintain identity, maintain the emotional baseline it has practiced the most. So the real question isn't, why do I feel this way? The real question is, how many times have I practiced feeling this way without noticing? Because once you see that, you begin to understand something that changes everything. You're not reacting to the world, you're rehearsing it. And if that's true, then something deeper is happening beneath your awareness. Something that doesn't just influence how you feel, but quietly shapes what you expect to experience next. The most dangerous threat in your life might be the one you've learned to ignore, not because it's weak, but because it's constant. You don't see it. You don't hear it. There's no clear moment when it begins or ends. It doesn't announce itself like fear or explode like anger. It lingers, quietly, in the background of your day. And because it never fully disappears, your system never fully relaxes. This is the hidden cost of living in a state your body believes is necessary for survival. Because once your nervous system is conditioned to expect tension, it doesn't wait for evidence anymore. It predicts. It prepares. It assumes. Before anything even happens, think about how quickly your mood can shift without a clear reason. One thought, one memory, one subtle trigger, and suddenly your entire internal state changes. Your body tightens, your breathing shortens, your attention narrows, not because of reality, but because your system recognized a familiar pattern, and it responded automatically. This is where the invisible threat reveals itself. You are no longer responding to events. You are responding to associations. Your brain links certain thoughts, environments, even times of day, to emotional states you've experienced before. And once that link is created, it doesn't need logic to activate. It just needs a A glance, a silence, a pause in conversation, and suddenly your body reacts as if something meaningful just happened, even if nothing did. This is how deeply repetition shapes your experience. Over time, your system becomes so efficient at predicting familiar emotions that it starts generating them in advance. Preloading stress, preloading tension, preloading discomfort. As if it's trying to stay one step ahead of something that isn't actually there. And here's the part most people never realize. The body would rather be right about a familiar danger than calm in an unfamiliar peace. Because survival isn't about truth. It's about predictability. So if your system has learned that the world is uncertain, overwhelming, or demanding, it will continue to create internal states that match that expectation. Even in neutral moments, even in safe environments, even when nothing is wrong. This is why you can't simply relax on command. Because for your nervous system, relaxation is not just a physical shift. It's a loss of control, a step into the unknown. And the unknown to a conditioned system feels like a risk. So instead of letting go, your body holds on, subtly, constantly, keeping you slightly alert, slightly guarded, slightly ready, as if something might happen at any moment. But what if that readiness is the very thing creating the experience you're trying to avoid? What if staying in this state is not protecting you, but quietly shaping your perception, your reactions, and even your future? Because if your system keeps preparing for a problem, it may start organizing your reality around finding one. And once that cycle is fully in motion, it becomes harder to tell the difference between what's real and what's been rehearsed so many times. It feels inevitable. At some point, it stopped being something you feel, and it became something you are. You don't notice the moment it happens. There's no clear line between "this is just a reaction" and "this is just who I am." But over time, the repetition of certain emotional states begins to shape your identity in ways that feel permanent. You start saying things like, "I'm just an anxious person. I've always been like this. This is how I deal with things." And it feels true. Not because it's objectively true, but because it's been practiced so many times that your brain and body no longer question it. This is where the pattern locks in. Because once an emotional state becomes part of your identity, your system begins to defend it. Not consciously, but biologically. Your thoughts start aligning with it. Your attention starts filtering reality through it. Your reactions become consistent with it. And slowly, your entire experience of life begins to orbit around that internal state. Even when you want something different, even when you try to change, you may decide to be calmer, more present, less reactive. But then something small happens, a delay, a tone of voice, an unexpected shift, and instantly your body returns to what it knows, before your conscious mind has time to intervene. Because identity isn't just a belief. It's a memorized state of being. Your body knows how to be you better than your mind knows how to change. And that creates a quiet conflict. Part of you wants something new, but a deeper part of you keeps recreating what's familiar. Not because you lack discipline, not because you're doing something wrong, but because your system has been conditioned to maintain coherence with the identity it recognizes, even if that identity is built on stress, tension, or emotional survival. This is why change feels so difficult. Not because it's complicated, but because it requires you to step outside of who your body believes you are. And that feels unnatural, almost like losing yourself. So instead, you return, again and again, to the same reactions, the same emotional cycles, the same internal environment. And each time you do, you reinforce the identity even more, until it feels fixed, stable, unquestionable. But here's something most people never consider. If your identity was built through repetition, then it was never truly fixed to begin with. It was learned, practiced, reinforced, which means it can also be interrupted, but not in the way most people try. Because you can't think your way out of something your body has memorized. You can't force a new identity on top of an old emotional baseline. There has to be a shift that goes deeper than thought, deeper than intention. Something that begins to loosen the connection between what you feel and who you believe you are. And that shift doesn't start with effort. It starts with something far more subtle, something most people overlook completely, because it doesn't look like change at all. The harder you try to change, the more your body resists. And that's not failure, that's feedback. Because there's a hidden tension most people never see between what you consciously want and what your system has been unconsciously trained to maintain. You decide to stay calm, but your body is already preparing for stress. You try to slow down, but something inside you keeps pushing forward. You tell yourself, it's okay, but your system doesn't believe you. Not yet. Because your thoughts are speaking a new language, while your body is still fluent in the old one. And when those two don't match, something very specific happens. Your system chooses familiarity over intention. Every time. This is why change feels inconsistent. One moment, you feel clear, present, in control. And the next, you're back inside the same reaction you've lived 100 times before. It feels like a setback, but it's actually a collision. A collision between a new possibility and an old memorized state. And in that collision, your nervous system does what it was designed to do: protect what it knows, even if what it knows is limiting. Because from the perspective of your body, unfamiliar doesn't mean better. Unfamiliar means uncertain, and uncertainty to a conditioned system feels like a threat. So when you begin to move toward something new, calm, clarity, stability, your body interprets it as a loss of control, and it pushes back, not loudly, but subtly, through restlessness, through distraction, through thoughts that pull you back into old emotional patterns. And if you're not aware of this, you'll misinterpret the signal. You'll think, this isn't working. I can't maintain it. This just isn't who I am. But what's actually happening is something much more precise. Your system is testing whether the new state is safe, whether it can trust it, whether it can survive in it. And until it receives enough repeated evidence, it will return to what it knows. Again. And again. And again. This is the tension. Not between you and the world, but between two versions of you. The one you've practiced, and the one you're beginning to glimpse. And the space between them is uncomfortable, unstable, unpredictable. But it's also where something important begins. Because for the first time, you're no longer completely identified with the pattern. You're noticing it, watching it, questioning it. And that awareness creates a gap, a small one, but enough to interrupt the automatic cycle. Not to stop it completely, but to see it as it happens. And in that moment, when you see it without immediately becoming it, something shifts, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. Because now, the pattern is no longer invisible. And once something becomes visible, it can no longer control you in the same way. But that doesn't mean it disappears. It means something else is about to emerge. Something that doesn't come from force, but from a different kind of alignment your system has rarely experienced before. What if the state you've been trying to reach isn't something you create, but something you allow? Not by doing more, but by interrupting less. Because there's a moment, very brief, almost unnoticeable, where your body pauses before returning to the familiar pattern. A gap. Most people miss it because they're too focused on controlling the outcome instead of noticing the shift. But that gap is real, and it changes everything. It's the moment between the trigger and the reaction, between the thought and the emotional response, between who you've been and who you could become. And in that space, your system is no longer fully operating on the past. It's open, neutral, undefined, even if just for a second. This is where a different possibility begins. Not because you force it, but because you stop reinforcing the old. Think about it. Every time you react the same way, you strengthen the same wiring. Every time you feel the same emotion, you confirm the same identity. But what happens when you don't? Not perfectly, not consistently, just once. A moment where you notice the pattern and don't immediately follow it. A moment where your body starts to react, but you stay present, not suppressing, not resisting, just observing. That moment may feel small, insignificant, but to your nervous system, it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliar means new information, new data, a signal that something different is possible. This is how change actually begins. Not through intensity, but through interruption. Because your system doesn't need a dramatic transformation to shift. It needs evidence. Repeated, subtle experiences that show it a different way of being is safe. And those experiences don't come from effort alone. They come from coherence. A state where your attention, your awareness, and your body are no longer pulling in opposite directions. Where you're not trying to override the pattern, but gently stepping outside of it, even if just for a few seconds. And in those seconds, something remarkable happens. Your body doesn't get the usual signal. The expected reaction doesn't arrive. The familiar chemistry isn't fully activated. And for the first time, your system experiences a break in the cycle. A disruption, a possibility. It may feel uncomfortable, uncertain, even slightly disorienting. But that's not a sign that something is wrong. It's a sign that something is changing. Because you're no longer feeding the pattern in the same way. You're no longer confirming the same identity. You're creating space. And in that space, your system begins to recalibrate, slowly, quietly, without force. But here's the part most people don't realize. That small shift, that subtle interruption, is not the result. It's the beginning. Because once your system experiences even a glimpse of something different, it starts to question everything it thought was fixed. And that's when the real shift begins to unfold. Not just in how you feel, but in how you relate to the experience itself. At first, it feels like nothing is happening. No breakthrough, no dramatic change. No clear moment where everything suddenly becomes different. Just small pauses, subtle awareness, moments where you almost react, but don't fully go there. And part of you starts to wonder, is this enough? Because you've been conditioned to expect change to feel big, obvious, immediate. But this kind of shift doesn't announce itself. It reorganizes you quietly, from the inside, because what's changing isn't just your reaction. It's your relationship with the reaction. Before, the pattern would take over completely. Thought, emotion, body, all moving in the same direction without interruption. Now, something is different. There's a space, a presence, a part of you that is no longer fully merging with the experience. And that changes the dynamic entirely. Because once you stop becoming the pattern starts losing its power. Not instantly, not completely, but progressively. Each time you notice it without feeding it, each time you feel it without fully identifying with it, you weaken the automatic connection your system has relied on for so long, and something new begins to stabilize. Not a new thought, not a forced behavior, but a different internal state, one that doesn't come from tension, one that doesn't need urgency to feel alive. At first, it feels unfamiliar, even fragile, like it could disappear at any moment. And sometimes, it does. You slip back, react again, feel the old cycle return. But now, there's a difference. You see it faster. You recover quicker. You don't go as deep. Because your system is beginning to recognize another option, another way to respond, another way to be. And this is where the real shift begins. Not when the old pattern disappears, but when it no longer defines you, when it becomes something you experience, not something you are. And in that shift, your attention changes. Instead of being pulled automatically into stress, you begin to notice moments of neutrality, moments where nothing is wrong, moments where your body isn't preparing for something. At first, they're brief, easy to overlook, but the more you notice them, the more your system begins to register them as real, as available, as possible. And slowly, something starts to rebalance. Your nervous system begins to spend less time in defense, and more time in a state it hasn't visited often enough to trust yet. A state that doesn't demand reaction, a state that allows presence. And this is where something unexpected happens. You stop needing the familiar tension to feel like yourself. You stop searching for problems to validate your internal state. You stop rehearsing the same emotional cycles without realizing it. Not because you forced it, but because your system no longer depends on it in the same way. And when that happens, you begin to experience something that once felt out of reach. Not as a goal, but as a natural consequence of a system that is no longer constantly preparing for war. And yet, there's still one final layer most people never fully integrate. A layer that determines whether this shift becomes temporary, or something that quietly transforms the way you live, feel, and perceive everything moving forward. There comes a point where it's no longer about stopping the pattern. It's about no longer needing it. And that's a very different experience. Because up until now, most of the change has been happening through awareness, through noticing, through interrupting. But something deeper begins when your system starts to feel safe without the old emotional signals. Not intellectually, not as an idea, but physically, internally, real. You begin to sit in moments that used to feel uncomfortable, and they don't trigger the same reaction. Silence doesn't feel empty. Stillness doesn't feel threatening. Nothing happening doesn't feel like something is missing. And that's when you realize it was never about removing stress. It was about no longer depending on it. Because for a long time, that state, tension, urgency, anticipation, was familiar. It gave you a sense of control, a sense of readiness, a sense of identity, even if it came with a cost. Now, something else begins to take its place. Not excitement, not intensity, but a quiet stability, a grounded presence, a state where your body is no longer scanning, predicting, preparing, but simply being. And at first, this can feel strange. Because your system has spent so much time associating being alive with movement, reaction, and stimulation, that this new state feels almost too simple, too calm, too neutral. But this is where integration happens. Not when you achieve something new, but when your system becomes familiar with something it once resisted. And the way that familiarity builds is the same way the old patterns were created. Repetition. But now, instead of rehearsing stress, you're experiencing moments of coherence. Moments where your attention is not fragmented, where your body is not pulling you into the past, where your internal state is not being dictated by old emotional memories. And each time you remain in that state, even briefly, you're teaching your system something new. Not through force, but through experience. You're showing it that calm is not a threat, that presence is not a loss of control, that nothing happening can actually be safe. And slowly, your baseline begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that you start noticing the difference. You react less, you recover faster, you don't get pulled as deeply into the same cycles, because your system is no longer fully dependent on them. And this is where something important becomes clear. You're not trying to become a different person. You're allowing a different state to become familiar. And as that state becomes more natural, your thoughts begin to change without effort. Your reactions begin to shift without force. Your perception begins to open without resistance. Because your internal environment is no longer dominated by survival. It's no longer organized around anticipating problems. It's beginning to move into something else, something quieter, but more powerful. A state where your system is not preparing for what might go wrong, but is available for what could actually emerge. And that shift is what determines whether this becomes just another temporary change, or something that fundamentally alters how you experience your life from this point forward. At some point, you stop trying to change. Not because you gave up, but because there's nothing left to fight. The urgency fades. The need to fix, control, or anticipate softens. And what remains isn't emptiness. It's clarity. A quiet, stable awareness that doesn't need constant input to feel complete. This is where everything you've been experiencing begins to integrate. Not as an effort, but as a new baseline. You wake up, and your body is no longer preparing for something before the day even begins. You move through moments, without the same background tension pulling your attention away. You notice thoughts, but they don't immediately define how you feel. And most importantly, you no longer need the familiar emotional patterns to recognize yourself, because something deeper has taken their place. Not a new identity you forced into existence, but a state your system has finally learned to trust. This is what happens when the body stops living in the past, when it no longer relies on rehearsed emotions to navigate the present, when it no longer treats every moment like a continuation of something that already happened. As explored in the neuroscience principles shared by Dr. Joe Dispenza, true change is not when you think differently, but when your body no longer feels the need to return to what it has memorized. And that's what you're experiencing now. Not perfection, not a final destination, but a shift in how your system operates. Because the same world still exists, the same external conditions, the same uncertainties, but your internal response is no longer automatically shaped by them. You're not reacting from survival, you're responding from presence. And that changes everything, quietly but completely. Because when your system is no longer preparing for war, it stops searching for enemies. It stops interpreting neutral moments as threats. It stops organizing your perception around what could go wrong. And in that space, something else becomes available, not as a concept, but as a lived experience, a sense of openness, of possibility, of being here without needing to escape, anticipate, or defend. And from that state, your attention begins to move differently, not toward what is familiar, but toward what is actually in front of you, not guided by old patterns, but by a presence that isn't tied to the past. And this is the part most people never fully realize. You didn't change the world. You changed the way your system relates to it. And because of that, the world no longer feels like a battlefield. Not because it became safer, but because your body stopped acting like it never left the war. And in that shift, subtle, silent, almost invisible, you reclaimed something that was never actually lost, just buried under layers of repetition, conditioning, and familiar emotion. Now, there's nothing to force, nothing to chase, nothing to become. Just a state you no longer need to question. Because for the first time, it doesn't come from memory. It comes from you.